She slept on the floor for 15 years, resisting any help, bound by a promise made in despair. When a nurse with an angelic beauty appeared at her humble mud wall home, old secrets came to light, transforming their lives forever. A story about faith, distrust, and the power of human connection that will touch your heart. Subscribe, like, and comment where you're watching from this journey of overcoming that no one could have predicted. The rain lashed against the thatched roof with relentless fury, while lightning bolts sliced through the sky in luminous cracks that revealed for fleeting moments the face marked by anguish of that woman kneeling in the center of the small room. It was a night that seemed endless, where heaven and earth waged an ancient battle, and Mary Smith, then 27 years old, trembled not only from the cold that penetrated through the cracks in the mud wall, but from the fear that consumed her soul. Saint Barbara, protector against storms, I promise you to live in absolute simplicity, to sleep on the bare floor of this house, if the Lord spares my life in this place that shelters me, she whispered, her calloused hands tightly clutching a small bronze medallion. The wind howled like a wounded animal, tearing off shingles and shattering dreams. In the small town of Clear Creek, nestled among the ancient Appalachian Mountains, the storm of that night in March of 2008 would be remembered for generations. It took with it 5 lives, dozens of homes, and a considerable part of the local hope. But, as if by miracle, Mary Smith's humble dwelling remained intact, a small island of mud and wood in the midst of a sea of destruction. When the first ray of sun broke through the curtain of clouds on the horizon, revealing the desolate scene that had once been a vibrant community, Mary rose from the damp floor where she had spent the night in prayer. Her body ached, but her determination was sealed like the clay hardening beneath her bare feet. A promise had been made, a sacred pact that would shape the next 15 years of her existence. That morning, she removed the worn mattress from her old wooden bed frame and spread it directly on the dirt floor. Gradually, she distributed among her less fortunate neighbors the few pieces of furniture she owned, keeping only the bare necessities: an old wooden chest for her clothes, a small table with a stool where she worked on her embroidery, and an old radio, a gift from her deceased father. That would become her window to the outside world. And so began the routine that would repeat itself, as immutable as the seasons for the next 15 years. She would wake up before the first crow of the rooster, when the stars still dotted the sky and the pale moon bid farewell on the horizon. She would light the small wood stove, prepare a strong, bitter coffee without sugar, another small, self-imposed penance, and sit on the doorstep to watch the day dawn, while her hands instinctively reached for the colored threads and the embroidery hoop. "Good morning, Mrs. Smith. Don't you want a bed that's left over from my house? It's brand new." Mr. Johnson, the neighbor from the adjacent plot, would occasionally shout as he passed by on his way to the farm. "Thank you very much, but I don't need it. I'm fine like this," she would reply, with a restrained smile that didn't reach her brown eyes. Time passed, and the attempts to help dwindled, replaced by sidelong glances and whispered stories in the small shops and in the church square. "She's been shaken up since the storm," some said. "She made a very heavy promise," others commented. "It's too much pride, that's what it is," the most critical judged. But everyone, without exception, secretly admired the extraordinary quality of her embroidery, which told stories of Appalachian folklore with a precision and beauty that seemed impossible for hands so worn by work. There was something almost mystical in the way she captured with her colored threads the legends of Sasi Perere, explained, the Headless Mule, explained, Curupira, explained, and so many other figures that populated the Appalachian folklore. Each piece was like a small window into a world where the extraordinary seemed possible, where the magical and the everyday intertwined like the very threads of her creations. On Saturdays, she would carry her works in a wicker basket and walk 2 miles to the town fair, where she would set up a small makeshift stall. She sold her pieces for paltry prices, just enough to buy more thread, needles, and the basics for her austere subsistence. She was known by everyone, but intimate with no one. She exchanged few words, even fewer smiles, and returned at dusk to her voluntary solitude, like a turtle retreating into its protective shell, The land where she lived was her only material wealth, inheritance from past generations that stretched back to the first settlers of the region. It was 5 acres of fertile land, with a spring of crystal-clear water that never dried up, even in the most severe droughts. A treasure increasingly valuable in times of climate change and water scarcity, coveted by businessmen who saw beyond the immediate present. "Mrs. Smith, I have a proposal that will change your life," said a man in a suit and shiny shoes, appearing at her door uninvited. "I represent a group of investors interested in your property. We are willing to pay an amount that you can't even imagine." "It's not for sale," she replied dryly, without even raising her eyes from the embroidery hoop where she was working, her fingers moving with the precision of a Swiss watch. "But you haven't even heard the offer. Think about what you could do with so much money. A new house, comfort. Excuse me, but I've already said it's not for sale. And now, if you don't mind, I have work to do." She cut him off, finally facing the man with eyes that admitted no argument. He was not the first, nor would he be the last. They came from time to time, with broad smiles and even bigger promises. Some tried to intimidate her with legal jargon and veiled threats about eminent domain. Others appealed to emotion, talking about progress and development for the community. All left in the same way, crestfallen and empty-handed, defeated by the unwavering stubbornness of that apparently fragile woman. The years passed, leaving marks on her body, but not on her routine. Her hair, once a deep brown, now displayed silver strands that shone in the sun. Her hands, always nimble, began to show the first signs of arthritis, a silent pain that she endured without complaint, as just another part of her private penance. Her walk, once firm and decisive, gradually became more cautious, especially on cold mornings when her knees seemed to refuse to cooperate. Still, Mary Smith remained faithful to her promise. For 15 winters and 15 summers, her body rested on the same mat spread on the dirt floor. 15 full moon cycles found her embroidering by candlelight, when the electricity, a recent luxury in her house, failed during storms. 15 years of an almost monastic existence, where the only constant companion was the old radio that played regional music and broadcast Catholic novenas, connecting her to a faith that was, simultaneously, her prison and her fortress. It was on a sunny morning in April of 2023, when the plum trees in the backyard were laden with black, shiny fruit, that her solitary life was interrupted by soft knocks on the door. She was not expecting visitors, she never expected them, and approached with the distrust that had become her second skin. "Who is it?" she asked, keeping the door firmly closed. "Good morning. My name is Clara Miller. I'm a nurse with the Community Health Program. We're visiting the most isolated residents to check on their health conditions and offer basic assistance." Mary opened a crack in the door, just enough to see the young woman who was smiling on the other side. She was a young woman of no more than 30 years old, with translucent green eyes that contrasted with her tanned skin. There was something in her countenance that conveyed an almost palpable serenity, a light of her own that seemed to illuminate her surroundings. "I don't need a doctor or a nurse. I'm perfectly fine, thank you," Mary replied, closing the door without hesitation. But Clara Miller was not one to give up easily. The next day, she was at the door again, this time with a small jar in her hands. "I brought a homemade remedy for arthritis," she announced, when Mary opened the door slightly with evident irritation. "I noticed yesterday how you move your hands. My grandmother had the same problem, and this herbal preparation always relieved her." Mary eyed the jar suspiciously, but the pain she felt that particularly cold morning made her hesitate. How had this stranger noticed something she tried so hard to hide? "It's just an herbal infusion. It doesn't hurt to try," Clara insisted, with a smile that seemed capable of melting even the most resistant armor. "You can leave it there on the doorstep. I'll see it later," Mary finally conceded, moving away from the door without inviting the visitor in. The preparation remained untouched for 2 days. On the third, when the pain in her joints became almost unbearable after a particularly damp night, Mary yielded to temptation. She applied a small amount of the ointment and, to Her surprise felt almost immediate relief. It was a pleasant, warm sensation that gradually spread, untying knots of tension that she didn't even know existed. On Clara's fourth consecutive visit, Mary finally allowed her to enter. The young nurse observed with attentive eyes the austere interior of the house, the mat on the floor, the almost complete absence of furniture, the bare walls except for a wooden crucifix and a small image of Saint Barbara. But what really caught her attention were the embroidery hoops and meticulously organized embroidery on the small work table. "What extraordinary work!" she exclaimed, approaching to examine an embroidery that depicted the legend of Yara. "I've never seen anything like it. You managed to bring stories to life with these threads." A spark of pride momentarily lit up Mary's eyes. It was rare to receive such sincere praise, especially from someone who seemed to understand the value of her work beyond the purely decorative aspect. "I learned from my mother, who learned from her mother," she replied simply. "They are stories we cannot let die." "How much do you charge for pieces like these?" Clara asked, still marveling at the minute details of an embroidery that showed Curupira, explained, protecting the forest. Mary mentioned prices that made her creations worth little more than the cost of the material used. Clara couldn't hide her astonishment. "But that's absurd. These are true works of art. They should be worth 10, 20 times more." The conversation that day marked the beginning of a slow but significant change. Clara began to visit her regularly, bringing not only healthcare, but also a company that Mary, without realizing it, was beginning to long for. The young nurse had the rare gift of respecting silence without filling it with empty words, of offering help without hurting someone else's pride. Little by little, like a flower that reluctantly blooms after a long winter, Mary began to open up. She shared fragments of her story, of her childhood as the daughter of farm laborers, of the stories she heard by the wood stove, and now immortalized in her embroidery. She spoke of the devastating storm, although she still kept secret the exact nature of her promise. On a particularly hot afternoon, when the summer sun turned the small house into an oven, Clara asked directly, "Why do you sleep on the floor, Mrs. Smith?" "I've realized it's not for lack of means to have a bed." The silence that followed was so dense, it could be cut with a knife. Mary fixed her gaze on some invisible point, as if searching in the shadows for the appropriate answer. "It's my choice," she finally replied. "A promise I made a long time ago." Clara did not insist at that moment, intuiting that there were limits that could not yet be crossed. Instead, she changed the subject, commenting on the upcoming Feast of the Holy Spirit, a centuries-old tradition that colored the small town with its red and white flags, its revelry and processions. "This year will be special," she said with a gleam of enthusiasm in her eyes. "In addition to the religious celebrations, there will be a local crafts fair. I'm helping with the organization and—" She hesitated for a moment, as if measuring her next words. "I would really like you to participate. Your embroidery deserves to be seen by more people." Mary shook her head negatively. "I don't like crowds. I prefer to sell my pieces at the fair, as I always have." "But that's precisely the problem," Clara exclaimed, with a vehemence that surprised both of them. "You are selling your work for peanuts when you could be getting fair value. There are people who would pay very well for art like yours." The discussion stretched on with Clara, presenting increasingly persuasive arguments about the cultural and artistic value of the embroidery, while Mary entrenched herself in her resistance to change. Finally, like a river that yields to the persistence of water, the embroiderer accepted, not without reluctance, that some of her pieces be included in the exhibition, under the strict condition that her name not be disclosed. In the weeks leading up to the festival, Clara appeared almost daily, sometimes to check Mary's blood pressure. "Part of my job," she justified, sometimes to help her select the pieces for the exhibition. The house, once a sanctuary of silence, was now occasionally filled with laughter and conversation, a subtle but profound transformation that did not go unnoticed by the always attentive neighbors. "That nurse is an angel in Mrs. Smith's life," they commented. "I've never seen the woman talk so much since she arrived in town." The comment, although made without further intention, captured an essential truth. Clara had become a luminous presence in Mary's austere existence, bringing not only physical care, but a type of healing that was deeper and more necessary, the reconnection with the outside world, with the possibility of trust and affection. The Feast of the Holy Spirit arrived, coloring the town with its flags and banners. The sound of the bells of the main church mingled with the traditional music played by the bandstand band, while the smell of typical foods, bean stew, pork loin, Portuguese-style stew, perfumed the narrow cobblestone streets. Mary, however, remained at home, faithful to her routine and determined not to participate in the festive bustle. It was on the second day of the celebrations that Clara appeared, breathless and with eyes shining with excitement. "Mrs. Smith, you need to come with me now. Something incredible has happened." "What is it, girl? You look like you've seen a ghost." "Better than that. A famous designer from New York saw your embroidery at the exhibition and was absolutely delighted. She wants to meet the artist and place a large order for her next clothing collection." Mary felt her heart race, a confused mixture of fear and excitement running through her body. "I can't go, Clara. You know I don't like crowds." "But she's leaving early tomorrow morning. It's a unique opportunity. Your embroidery on clothes that will be shown in fashion shows, maybe even international ones." The internal struggle was visible on Mary's marked face. On one hand, the impulse to remain faithful to her reclusive existence. On the other, a long dormant spark of artistic ambition, of desire to see her work recognized and valued. "I'm not going dressed like this," she finally said, indicating the simple cotton dress she was wearing. Clara smiled, relieved. "I have something that might work," she said, taking a carefully wrapped package from her bag. It was a blue linen dress, simple but elegant, that Clara had bought especially for that occasion, in a demonstration of unwavering faith that she would be able to convince Mary to participate in the exhibition. The meeting with Louise Blackwood, the New York designer, was a turning point in Mary's life. The sophisticated woman, with her colorful rimmed glasses and expansive gestures, showed genuine respect for the craftsmanship she saw before her. "This is not just craftsmanship, it's art in its purest form," she declared, examining with admiration an embroidery that depicted the Feast of the Holy Spirit. "You managed to capture the soul of Appalachian traditions in a way I've never seen before." The proposal she made next left Mary stunned. A substantial order of themed embroidery for application in an exclusive collection, for an amount that surpassed everything she had earned in the last 5 years combined. "I don't know if I can accept," Mary murmured, overwhelmed by the magnitude of the offer. "Why not?" Louise asked, genuinely confused. "There are many pieces. I don't have the structure, I work alone." "We can establish a flexible schedule," the designer promptly replied. "And as for the value, it's absolutely fair for the level of excellence of your work." It was Clara who offered the solution that would change not only Mary's destiny, but that of the entire community. "What if we formed a group of local embroiderers? Mrs. Smith could teach her techniques and supervise the work, ensuring quality. I know several women in town who would be honored to learn from you." The idea, launched like a seed in the wind, found fertile ground. In the weeks that followed, the small mud wall house became a makeshift learning center. Women of all ages, from curious teenagers to ladies who, like Mary, kept ancestral embroidery knowledge, gathered 3 times a week to learn and share techniques. In this unexpected way, Mary found herself transformed from recluse to master, from solitary to the center of a small artisanal revolution. Her mat on the floor, once a symbol of isolation, now shared space with chairs and stools brought by the apprentices, who sat in a circle to absorb the knowledge of the master of threads, as they affectionately nicknamed her. The first installment of the payment for Louise's order allowed for basic improvements to the house. A new roof that didn't leak on rainy nights, windows with glass panes that kept the winter cold outside, an expansion of the workspace. Still, faithful to her promise, Mary continued to sleep on the floor, an increasingly evident contrast to the transformations around her. It was during this phase of renovation that a new disturbing element came into play. A business group, larger, and more aggressive than the previous ones, sent not only representatives with financial proposals, but also a lawyer with documents alleging irregularities in the land documentation. "It's just a formality," explained the man in an impeccable, suit and calculated smile. "Sign these papers authorizing preliminary studies on the land, and we will resolve all legal issues for you." Mary, now more confident thanks to the support of the community that had formed around her, refused to sign any document without first consulting her own lawyer. Clara, present at the time of the visit, noticed something familiar in the company logo printed on the documents, a detail that left her visibly disturbed. That night, after the lawyer left, Clara stayed longer than usual, restless and silent. Finally, like someone gathering courage for a dive into unknown waters, she sat next to Mary on the front doorstep, where they watched the starry sky. "I have something very serious to tell you, Mrs. Smith, and I fear that after this, you will never want to see me again." The grave tone of her voice caused a pang in the embroiderer's heart. Could this young woman who had brought so much light into her life be carrying some terrible secret? "Speak quickly, girl. Whatever it is, better to face it head on." Clara took a deep breath, her trembling hands holding a glass of water as if it were a protective amulet. "The man who came today, the lawyer, he works for Clear Creek Mineral Water Co. So what? I've had other people interested in the land before." "Yes, but the owner of the company, Frank Miller, he's my father." The silence that followed was like an abyss opening up between them. Mary stared at the young woman with eyes that gradually lost the warmth acquired in recent months, replaced by a defensive coldness that Clara knew well from their first encounters. "So all this, your concern, the visits, the exhibition, it was just to soften me up, to make your father's job easier?" "No, never. When I was assigned to the community health program, I had no idea you owned this land. I only found out when my father mentioned your name during a family dinner, saying he was having trouble with a stubborn old woman who refused to sell the property." Tears streamed down Clara's face, but did not soften Mary's heart, which closed up like a wounded shell. "I want you to leave now," said the embroiderer, getting up with difficulty. "And don't come back. Please, Mrs. Smith, let me explain." "There's nothing to explain. I thought I had found a friend, when in fact you were just another person trying to take advantage of me. Get out of my house now." The news of the breakup between Mary and Clara spread quickly through the small community, dividing opinions. Some defended the nurse, highlighting all the good she had done not only for Mary, but for other families served by the health program. Others saw confirmation of old suspicions about city folks and their always hidden intentions. The following weeks were a setback for Mary. Although she maintained the meetings with the embroiderers out of commitment to Louise's order, her spirit had closed up again. The smile that had begun to appear more frequently became rare again. Conversations reduced to the minimum necessary for the transmission of technical knowledge. At night, alone on her mat on the floor, she allowed herself to feel the pain of betrayal, a wound that seemed deeper than any other she had ever experienced. She had opened her heart, lowered defenses built up over decades, only to confirm what she had always known. Trusting was too risky. Distraction came from an unexpected source. A severe drought hit the region, the worst in decades, drying up artesian wells and leaving entire communities dependent on water trucks sent by the city hall. Water rationing became part of everyday life, with specific times for its use in homes. The spring on Mary's land, however, maintained its constant flow, as it always had even during the driest periods. This phenomenon, already known by the oldest residents, gained new relevance in the face of the current water crisis. It was Mrs. Kind, one of the oldest embroiderers in the group, who first brought up the subject during one of the meetings. "Mrs. Smith, they say in town that your spring is the only one that hasn't dried up." Mary nodded without raising her eyes from the embroidery hoop where she was working. "It never dries up. My grandfather used to say it's because it reaches the heart of the mountain. My 5-year-old granddaughter has had a fever for 3 days, continued the old lady. The doctor said we need to bathe her to lower her temperature, but we've been without water since yesterday. Would you allow us to fetch some?" The request, made with such humility, touched something deep in Mary's hardened heart. She nodded silently, and that same afternoon little Anna Louise received her therapeutic bath with the fresh, pure water from the ancestral spring. The news spread like wildfire. The next day, a line of people with buckets and bottles formed at the entrance to the property. Mary, initially uncomfortable with so many strangers in her sanctuary, ended up establishing an orderly system. She designated a specific time for water collection, thus avoiding overcrowding and ensuring the sustainability of the spring. What began as an emergency act of solidarity transformed, in the following weeks, into a catalyst for the rebirth of old community traditions. In exchange for water, people offered what they had: food harvested from their gardens, homemade products like jellies and jams, small services like repairs to the roof or fence that surrounded the property. Without realizing it, Mary became the center of a barter system that invigorated social bonds, reminding everyone of the value of interdependence in times of crisis. The mat on the floor, which previously symbolized isolation and penance, now witnessed community meetings where problems were discussed and solutions found collectively. It was during one of these improvised meetings, when they were debating the possibility of installing a more efficient water collection and distribution system from the spring, that Clara reappeared. She was visibly thinner, with deep dark circles under her eyes that showed sleepless nights, but there was a renewed determination in her countenance. The initial reaction was general discomfort. Everyone there knew the story of the betrayal, and hostile looks were directed at the newcomer. Mary, however, remained impassive, observing the young woman with cautious but not completely closed eyes. "I know I'm not welcome, but I needed to come," Clara began, her voice trembling but determined. "I bring important information that you need to know." She placed a folder full of documents on the table: environmental studies, hydrographic maps, technical reports. With the eloquence of someone who mastered the subject, she explained that the spring on Mary's land was not an isolated phenomenon, but part of a complex aquifer system that fed underground rivers throughout the region. My father's company's plan was not only to commercially exploit the mineral water here, but to divert the main course of the spring to a larger plot of land, already acquired 2 miles away. This would dry up not only this source, but affect the entire local ecosystem within a radius of 20 miles. The revelation caused an uproar among those present. For many of those small farmers, water was more than a resource. It was life. Livelihood, continuity. "How did you find out about this?" Mary finally asked, breaking her silence. "I accessed internal company documents," Clara replied. "When I learned about the full plans, I confronted my father. I said I couldn't condone something that would destroy the environmental balance of an entire region, affecting hundreds of families." She hesitated for a moment, as if seeking strength for the following confession. "He gave me an ultimatum. Either I sided with the family company, or I would be disinherited. I chose what I believe is right. I am no longer welcome in my parents' house, and I lost my job in the health program, apparently for inappropriate conduct, although everyone knows it was my father who pushed for the dismissal." The silence that followed was charged with tension and reassessment. Mary attentively studied the young woman's face, looking for any sign of falsehood. What she found was only exhaustion and a raw honesty that could not be feigned. "Why did you come back?" she finally asked. "You've already lost everything because of us. You could have simply left, started over somewhere else." Clara looked directly into the older woman's eyes without hesitation. "Because here, I found something I never had before. A true purpose. Seeing what you are building together, not just the embroidery cooperative, but now this mutual support network during the drought, made me believe that there are more important values than social status or material comfort. I want to be part of it, if you will accept me." The following weeks were of intense activity. Armed with the information brought by Clara, the community mobilized to legally protect the spring and the entire aquifer system. Volunteer lawyers from an environmental NGO were contacted, complementary studies carried out, petitions organized. In parallel, the embroidery cooperative gained formal structure. The first order for Louise Blackwood was successfully delivered and generated additional orders, not only from the original designer, but also from other professionals who learned about the work through her. With Clara's technical support, whose training included not only nursing but also administration, they established fair prices, appropriate contracts, and an equitable system for distributing profits. The impact on the community was transformative. Women who previously depended exclusively on the income of husbands or sons gained financial autonomy. Young people who considered migrating to big cities in search of opportunities found reasons to stay, learning ancestral techniques that were now proving economically viable. Men who initially mocked the women's thing began to offer logistical support, building a suitable shed for larger-scale production. Mary watched it all with a mixture of pride and bewilderment. How could she imagine, on that stormy night 15 years ago, that her promise of absolute simplicity would lead, through tortuous paths, to such a profound community rebirth? The legal battle against Clear Creek Mineral Waterco was long and difficult. Frank Miller, Clara's father, used all the resources at his disposal: local politicians, friendly judges, the media he indirectly controlled through generous advertising. In response, the community organized peaceful demonstrations, won the support of national environmentalists, and used social media to publicize their cause. The turning point came when a renowned documentary filmmaker, attracted by the unusual story, produced a short film about Mary and the importance of the spring. The film, initially shown at an independent festival, went viral on the internet, bringing national attention to the conflict. Suddenly, what was a local dispute transformed into a symbol of the struggle between environmental preservation and corporate greed. Amidst all this whirlwind of events, one constant remained. Mary still slept on the floor. The house had been renovated, new furniture acquired, appliances installed, but the mat directly on the dirt floor remained her resting place. "Why do you insist on sleeping like this, Mrs. Smith?" a journalist once asked her, who came to interview her about the conflict with the mining company. "Is it some kind of protest?" "It's a promise," she replied simply, without elaborating. It was Clara who finally addressed the issue head-on, one night when they were working together on the financial organization of the cooperative. The relationship between the two had been rebuilt slowly, like a particularly delicate embroidery that requires patience and precision. "Mrs. Smith, I need to ask you something very personal," she began, closing the account book they were analyzing. "This promise to sleep on the floor, it was made during the great storm of 2008, wasn't it?" Mary nodded silently. "And it was made to St. Barbara, right? The protector against storms." Another affirmative nod. "You promised to live in absolute simplicity if you were spared from the destruction that hit so many others." "How do you know that?" Mary asked, genuinely surprised. "I put the pieces together over time. The image of the saint in a prominent place in the house, the date of the storm that coincides with the beginning of your habit, occasional comments from the oldest neighbors." Mary sighed deeply, like someone finally letting out a secret kept for too long. "I was terrified that night. The wind seemed like it was going to tear the house from its foundations. I heard screams outside, things breaking. I prayed like I had never prayed before and made the promise. If St. Barbara protected me, I would live in absolute simplicity. I would sleep on the floor as penance and a sign of gratitude." Clara listened attentively without interrupting. When Mary finished her account, she asked softly, "And do you believe that the saint would be happy to see that, because of this promise, you are putting your health at risk? The back pain, the knee problems." "A promise is a promise," Mary replied, with her characteristic stubbornness. "I know someone who might be able to help with this question," Clara said after a moment of reflection. "Father Anthony from St. Joseph Parish in the neighboring county. He has a deep knowledge of theology and religious traditions. Perhaps he can offer a perspective that you haven't considered yet." The meeting with Father Anthony, an elderly gentleman whose bright eyes revealed a serene wisdom, took place in Mary's own home. After Sunday Mass, instead of immediately questioning the promise, He began by asking about her embroidery, showing a genuine interest in the art and the stories they told. Gradually, the conversation evolved to themes of faith, devotion, and the true meaning of vows and promises. With gentleness and respect, he explained that in the Catholic tradition, promises that harm health or prevent a person from fulfilling their responsibilities can be reinterpreted or commuted into other forms of devotion. Mrs. Smith, do you believe that Saint Barbara desires your suffering? Or would she be happier to see you using your gifts to uplift and sustain this community, as you have been doing lately? The question hung in the air, without requiring an immediate answer. Before saying goodbye, the priest left a small book about the life of Saint Barbara, suggesting that perhaps there she would find inspiration for a new way to honor her promise. In the following nights, by the light of a lantern, Mary devoured the book, discovering facets of the saint she did not know. She learned that Barbara, according to tradition, had been a young woman who defied conventions and impositions to follow her conscience and faith, that her strength was not in submission or self-flagellation, but in the courage to transform the reality around her. The epiphany came during a stormy night that resembled in its ferocity that of 15 years ago. The heavy rain had caused leaks in the newly built cooperative shed, threatening materials and pieces in progress. Mary and other embroiderers spent hours trying to contain the damage, moving furniture, placing buckets, protecting months of work. Exhausted, soaked to the bone, Mary returned to her house well after midnight. The mat on the floor was damp due to a leak in the roof that she had not noticed before leaving. With no viable alternative for sleeping, she accepted Clara's suggestion, who had accompanied her on the rescue mission, and went to the small, local church, where the priest had offered temporary shelter for anyone who needed it during the storm. In the silence of the chapel, observing the image of Saint Barbara illuminated by votive candles, Mary had an experience that she would later describe as more real than reality itself. The saint seemed to smile as she held not only the sword and the palm of martyrdom, her traditional symbols, but also needle and thread, embroidering a complex pattern that, somehow, Mary recognized as the story of her own life and community. The true sacrifice is to serve others with the gifts you have received, she seemed to hear, although there was no one nearby besides a few villagers asleep on the church benches. It is not the hard floor that honors the promise, but the soft heart that opens itself to others. The next morning, the storm had passed, leaving a sky of a blue almost painful in its perfection. The inaugural festival of the officially established cooperative coincided with the arrival of international buyers interested in the embroidery that was already beginning to gain a reputation beyond national borders. Amidst the celebrations and negotiations, few noticed when Mary discreetly asked Mr. Johnson, the neighbor carpenter, and his son John, a talented cabinet maker, for help. The task she entrusted to them was carried out in secret in the following days: the construction of a bed. Not just any bed, but a work of art in local hardwood, carved with motifs that retold the story of the storm, the promise, the spring, and the community rebirth. Each embroiderer of the cooperative contributed a small embroidered panel that, together, formed a unique and beautiful quilt for the mattress. This one, new and comfortable. On the night of the piece's unveiling, Mary gathered her closest friends for a simple blessing ceremony, where Father Anthony sprinkled water from the spring on the new bed, consecrating it not as a breaking of a promise, but as an evolution of a commitment. This bed, Mary explained with a voice choked with emotion, does not represent abandonment of my gratitude to Saint Barbara, but a new way of expressing it. I will sleep in it thinking not only of my individual salvation on that stormy night, but of the collective salvation that we are building together. That night, for the first time in 15 years, Mary Smith slept elevated from the floor. The dream she had was vivid. She saw herself embroidering together with other women, including her deceased mother and grandmother, under the gentle guidance of a luminous figure she recognized as Saint Barbara. The embroidery they created together was immense, extending beyond the visible horizon, connecting past, present, and future in a pattern of transcendent beauty. The following months brought prosperity not only to Mary, but to the entire community. The embroidery cooperative expanded, now including a training program for young people interested in preserving traditional techniques. The spring was officially declared an environmental preservation area, protected by state and federal laws against any attempt at predatory commercial exploitation. Mary's transformation, from distrustful recluse to respected community leader, inspired others to reevaluate their own self-inflicted limitations. Clara, now fully integrated into the community and considered by everyone as the angel who had changed everything, established a small preventive health clinic that combined modern knowledge with the traditional wisdom of herbs and home remedies. Frank Miller, the defeated businessman, eventually sought reconciliation with his daughter. The process was slow and not without relapses, but the example of forgiveness and transformation he had witnessed in the community of Clear Creek planted seeds that over time would bloom into a renewed relationship, although never again based on expectations of blind conformity to family values, but on mutual respect and acceptance of differences. On full moon nights, it was still possible to see Mary sitting on the porch of her renovated house, embroidering stories of transformation and rebirth. By her own choice, she sometimes still sat directly on the floor, no longer as penance, but to feel the direct connection with the earth that sustained everyone. The floor that for so long had symbolized her limitation had become just the firm foundation on which she had built a new life, proving that sometimes we need an angel, or someone who believes in us more than we believe in ourselves, to free ourselves from the cages we build ourselves. The story of Mary Smith and Clara Miller, of the promise and its evolution, of the protected spring and the reborn community, spread far beyond the borders of Clear Creek. It became a symbol of how tradition and innovation can walk together, of how individuality and collectivity can strengthen each other, of how even the most rigid promises can transform without losing their sacred essence. And whenever someone asked Mary if she regretted the 15 years sleeping on the floor, she smiled with the serenity of someone who had found meaning even in suffering. Each night on that mat was a stitch in the embroidery of my life. Without them, the design would not be the same. The important thing is not where we sleep, but with what purpose we wake up each morning.